All right, everybody who's watching, thanks for joining me on this Facebook Live. Here's a new format I'm going to try out for 2020. So today I want to talk about HRV, and a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I've been doing HRV and using it for close to 20 years now, and really over the last 3 to 5, it's become more and more popular. You've seen more and more apps out there, more people talking about it, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I really want to just kind of set the record straight. And the second thing is really just to help you get the most out of it, whether you're using my app, Morpheus, or another one. There's a lot of things that you can do to use HRV effectively. So my goal is to help you essentially learn how to do that over the next 30 minutes or so. All right, so to get started here, again, my background in HRV goes back to all the way back to 2002. And that's actually a picture of me working with a former Seahawk named Heath Evans. And really, the old school days, we had to measure HRV by sticking a bunch of electrodes on your chest, which was not always the most practical. And the system I used was about $35,000. Again, it was really something designed for high-level teams and coaches. It was not something your average person was ever going to use in fitness. So this is way before wearables were a thing. Now, over the years, I had so much success using HRV, I really couldn't imagine coaching without it. And I'd been coaching a lot of fighters from all over the world, and as soon as they would leave where I was training out of Seattle, I really had no way to monitor them. And I felt like I was coaching in the dark, and I was just making guesses, trying to help them online. So 2011, I developed one of the early HRV apps called BioForce HRV, and that was really the first start for me into the wearable scene and getting into the apps. And really what I wanted to do was just take the coaching tools I've been using over the years and give them to everyday people so they didn't have to spend $35,000. All of a sudden, they can just spend a couple $100 and they could get BioForce HRV. And again, this is all the way back in 2011, before wearables really exploded. And over the next few years, more and more wearables obviously started coming out. Now, 2018, just a couple years ago, was really the progression of my HRV, and that's when I launched our app that we have now called Morpheus, which we'll talk a little bit about throughout this. But again, my point here is not to just tell you how to use Morpheus, to go by Morpheus. I really want to just help you understand more about what HRV is and how to get the most out of it. Okay, so first and foremost, what is HRV? And this is a question I get asked all the time, and it's a confusing one for most people because the first thing they think about is just heart rate and what's the difference between heart rate and HRV. And the reality is there's a big difference between heart rate and HRV. They are two different things entirely. So let's talk about what that means. Okay, first, we have to understand that everything starts with energy. And that means your body has to produce energy every single day in order to meet the demands that you place upon it. And we can categorize these demands into 3 broad areas. All right, the first is just physical activity, which is training, walking around, doing those sorts of things, and mental stress. And just as you realize when you're mentally stressed, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, mental stress takes energy too. And then the second category is just your vital functions, okay? Your liver, your heart, your lungs, your brain, all these different organs have to have a constant supply of energy in order for your body to stay alive. And if it doesn't have that energy, you're not going to be around very long. So your metabolism is always working hard in order to make sure that it doesn't happen. And that's really the minimum amount of calories there is what we'd call your resting metabolic rate or your basal metabolic rate, R&R type of stuff. All right, now the third category, which is also hugely important if your goal is to improve your fitness, is the actual changes that happen to muscle tissues and cardiovascular tissues and tendons and ligaments and all these different areas that cause our bodies to actually improve our fitness. So there's a whole lot of areas here that need energy. That's the bottom line. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because HRV is really about looking at energy. Because what drives energy are the 2 halves of what we call the autonomic nervous system. All right, you have basically we call your fight or flight, and that's the sympathetic nervous system, and people are familiar with that. Again, mostly from the fight or flight side of things. That's what increases your heart rate, your blood pressure. It diverts energy into the muscles that are working or into your brain when you're doing something mentally demanding. And it's inherently catabolic. Okay, that means it's breaking muscle tissue or breaking energy down and facilitating it into those different areas. It's a catabolic system. It gives us the energy we need in order to go out and fight or flight or do something else. Now, the other half of the parasympathetic, or other half of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic side. Okay, this is the rest and recover or rest and digest system. And this is doing essentially the opposite function for the most part to the sympathetic. That means it's slowing down your heart rate, it's decreasing your blood pressure, it's promoting energy storage. Okay, so after we burn a bunch of energy doing something either physically or mentally demanding, we've got to put that energy back and we've got to rebuild those tissues and we've got to make them bigger and stronger, hopefully. and that's an anabolic side. Okay, so you have these two halves of the autonomic nervous system that regulate energy production and regulate energy distribution. This is hugely important to understand, because at the end of the day, this is what we're looking at with the autonomic nervous system via HRV. And we do that by looking at the pattern of the heart rate. And you have this thing called the RR interval, which is really just the amount of time in between heartbeats, and one heartbeat to the next. Now, when the sympathetic system is active, whether you're doing something mentally or physically demanding, that RR interval shortens as your heart rate increases. By inverse of that, the parasympathetic nervous system lengthens and increases those intervals as your resting heart rate or your heart rate decreases. And so what we're looking at is the pattern of your heart rate at rest, generally speaking, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, to essentially understand what that balance looks like. And when we see a very specific pattern of the heart rate and those RR intervals changing over time, then it tells us about the autonomic nervous system. It tells us about the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. And we see very specific patterns of those intervals. So this is what we call a rhythmogram. And those little bar graphs there are just showing essentially what the intervals look like over a specific time period. This is a couple minutes. And so when the sympathetic system is very active, you tend to see a very regular heart rate pattern there. And that's the top one. That'd be more of a sympathetic pattern. So you see very little variability, like the name implies, in that pattern. That tells us that the parasympathetic nervous system is very low. That's what's going to happen when you are in fight or flight or sympathetic mode. Now, in the other case, you see a more parasympathetic nervous system pattern, that one there below. Right? You see a lot of variability from one beat to the next, the next, the next. And that essentially just is an indication that the parasympathetic nervous system is on high, or is much higher than in the top case. And you see this pattern much more in a rest, digest, regenerate type phase. So again, what heart rate variability is looking at is this pattern of heart rate. But what it's actually telling us is what your body is doing with the energy that it's producing. When we see a very specific pattern like the one above, we would see a very low HRV number. It would tell us that you are in a stressed or more catabolically driven state. If we see the pattern down below, it would tell us that you are in a more recovery driven state that's anabolic and driven more by the parasympathetic nervous system. So those two systems, again, are showing us very different patterns, and that's what HRV is actually measuring. Oops. Okay, so again, it's the current activity between the parasympathetic nervous system. It's looking at the balance between the stress and the recovery side, the catabolic and the anabolic side. Now, this is an important point to point out here, is that at the daily level, meaning looking at my HRV on a daily basis, okay, HRV is not predicting performance. And this is something that people mistake all the time. They think that if HRV is low, it means you're going to go out and perform poorly. Or if your HRV is high, you're going to go out and hit your PRs or whatever. That's not the case. It's not predicting performance just based on a single day's measurement. It's just telling you where your body is at in that one point in time. It's like looking at your blood pressure, or looking at your heart rate, or looking at your body temperature. All those things are indication of what's going on within the body, but performance and injuries and all these things are very multifaceted. There's lots of different variables driving all those. There's no single number out there that can predict performance or can predict injuries on a single day to any high level of accuracy. So you never want to think that like, oh, my HRV is low, therefore I'm going to go out and perform poorly. Because this is, again, if you make that mistake in your thinking, then if you think as soon as you go out and you perform well when your HRV might not look great, then you think, oh, well, HRV is just not accurate. No, HRV is accurate at what it's showing you. It's just not intended to predict performance or to predict injuries if you're just looking at a single point in time. You're just looking at one point. Okay, really, when we look at HRV over time, on the other hand, in other words, looking at the trend data, this is where we can often see correlation to changes in performance and sometimes changes in probability of injury. But again, it's not always a direct one-to-one. I can't always predict a performance by looking at trend over time, because again, there's so many variables in performance. But what we can do is look at the trends over time to see if your fitness level has changed, particularly in sports with high aerobic demands, because that is what's going to be the most predicted from HRV, since it correlates so strongly to aerobic fitness. If you're talking about a purely anaerobic sport, weightlifting, Olympic lifting, shot put, these sorts of sports don't have a huge aerobic demand, So looking at change in aerobic fitness is not really going to have any impact on change in actual sport performance. Okay, so why should we care about HRV? Well, there's lots of reasons, to be honest. The first is that as the sympathetic system increases energy production, this promotes inflammation. Inflammation over long periods of time is not a good thing for a variety of reasons. Not only does it short circuit your fitness improvements, but it sets you up for long-term diseases and all sorts of things that you don't want to get. It's the other side of the equation. It's that parasympathetic nervous system that we're measuring through the HRV that suppresses inflammation by preventing the release of little inflammatories called cytokines, inflammatory proteins. So if we're able to measure this inflammatory status over a long period of time, we can make sure that you or people you're working with, your coach, are not going down that path of cardiovascular disease or stroke or any of these things that kill so many people across the world. We can make sure that your body is able to shut off the inflammation that's ultimately being produced as a result of stress. So again, we always have to make sure that our stress and our anti-stress, which is the parasympathetic side, are in the right balance, and that's what HRV is going to help us do. Again, the second thing, like I mentioned, if your goal is to perform on any level, any sort of sport where you have an aerobic demand, there's quite a bit of research showing that changes in HRV over time correlate to changes in actual performance. So in this case, they basically looked at people's across or HRV across a 8-week program, and they looked at their change in their 10-kilometer running time and their change in their max aerobic speed. And really, without digging too deeply in the study, what they found was that only the people whose HRV had gone up on average across that 8-week study, only those people saw improvements in their running time, their max aerobic speed. If they did not see a change in HRV, those were termed non-responders. Those people's performances tended to not really change over the course of those 8 weeks. So if we look at long-term changes and trends, it's going to help us essentially figure out, did our fitness improve? And we can look at those things happening before we go run this race or this next competition. We can know whether or not we're likely to improve our performance or not, and we can improve things along the way to make sure that does actually happen. Now, the other thing I mentioned, again, a single day, a single point in time is not going to 100% ever predict an injury. But this was a good paper called Heart Rate Variability is a Moderating Factor in Workload Injury Relationship of Competitive CrossFit Athletes. I mentioned this because this is a fairly recent paper. And what they looked at essentially was the workload of a given workout, and they looked at their HRV essentially prior to that. And what they found was that higher workloads with lower HRVs left somebody more likely to get injured. So if you had a very low HRV score and you had a very high workload, which is that little circle there, then you had a much, much greater probability of injury than if you had the same workload but a higher HRV. So essentially what we can say is, again, HRV itself may not be predicting injury per se, but what it's showing us is that if your body is already in a very stressed state and it's not able to devote its resources towards recovery, and you put it under another high workload, it's really just a sign you've probably accumulated quite a bit of fatigue in the process of leading up to that point, and you're more susceptible to injury as a result. So again, if our goal is to stay healthy, then we want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to facilitate that, and looking at HRV not really just on a daily basis, but looking at it over time is going to help us make sure we're choosing the loads that are appropriate, that are going to prevent injuries from happening, or at least reduce their likelihood. Another one here looked at sleep and HRV, and what you see over and over again is that sleep and HRV are extremely closely related. So as we have circadian rhythm problems, we don't get enough sleep, we don't get enough quality sleep, we see very distinct changes in HRV, and what we see is shifts towards catabolic activity, because sleep is really the most anabolic time we have. It's where we have the most time for recovery, the most time for regeneration, and if we are not getting sleep or enough quality sleep, we see our HRV decrease and we see a shift towards a catabolic state, and that's where, again, we're going to lose muscle tissue and we're going to lose fitness, we're going to lose things that we've worked so hard to get. So we can monitor how effectively our training is working and make sure that our sleep is not derailing that by looking at our HRV trends and numbers as a result. Now, another one, stress and performance. This is a really interesting study. They looked essentially at different high-level soldiers going through different types of training for essentially war fighting. So they looked essentially at a bunch of different groups going through, and they looked at their HRV patterns going through these different types of stressful camps and war games. And basically what they found was that the people who were able to maintain higher HRV at rest, which means they were able to focus or shift their body into recovery mode rest, and then they were also able to shift their HRV down and go very stress response and fight or flight during the actual period where they needed that. The people that could do that, we call that range, heart rate variability range. The people that did that were the ones that survived these schools. These were essentially the warfighter schools, where if you failed, you were basically, you didn't make it to special forces. If you passed, then you got in. And they looked at really trying to figure out who would going to make it through and who wasn't. And looking at this pattern of HRV was one of the most significant things they found that correlated to the people that were able to make it through versus the people that weren't. Now, the other reason I point this out is the bottom line there. These differences in HRV are predictive of actual military and cognitive neuropsychological test performance scores assessed during and after stress. Now, the reason I point that out, what that means is HRV also predicted their cognitive abilities. In other words, their decision-making, their thought process, their self-restraint. It correlated and was very, very well associated with their mental performance. So even though we look primarily at HRV in terms of different fitness measures, it also gives us a great insight into someone's cognitive or mental performance capabilities as well, which is hugely important for self-restraint, for consistency, for all the things that we need in terms of, not just performance, but being able to follow a diet day in and day out, to be consistent with our training, do all those sorts of things. So HRV itself shows us and helps predict and develop the mental side of the game too, not just the physical side. Okay, last but not least is really HRV and longevity. So this is some data we pulled from the Morpheus system, and we looked at average heart rate variability across different age groups from 12 to 19, all the way up to 80 to 89. And really what you see here is a pretty linear, consistent drop. As you age, you're going to see a drop in HRV, and it correlates to all the other factors that drive aging. So the question is, can we prevent aging, or not prevent entirely, but can we at least slow it down? And of course, the answer is yes, through intelligent training, nutrition, and all these different lifestyle factors. So we can use HRV really as a barometer of, are we actually slowing down the aging process? If we're in the, I'm 40 years old right now, in the 40 to 49 category, the average HRV in that group is a 76. Well, if I can stay towards the top of that, then I know that I'm going to be essentially a biological age or younger than that. So we also looked here on the right, people in the top 10%. So if I wanted to get to the top 10% of 40 to 49, I'd want to get all the way up to a 90, which is significantly higher than a 76. So really, if your goal is just health, wellness, longevity, you can have some baselines and make sure that you are essentially having the HRV of somebody who is younger than you. So if I got all the way up to a 90, I'd be well above, even the 20-year-olds. And so, does that mean that I'm going to live to be 120? Maybe, probably not. But my chances of getting the common diseases, my chances of getting things that are going to, age me quickly are far, far less than if I'm on the lower end of the HRV scale. Okay, finally, HRV and fitness, really what this comes down to is the two systems that work together. Like I mentioned, the sympathetic system is driving all the energy into the muscles and areas you need when you train, but it's really the parasympathetic system that we're measuring through HRV that's driving protein synthesis. And protein synthesis is what's driving the changes in fitness and performance that we want. We're producing bigger muscle fibers, we're producing more mitochondria, we're making changes to the cardiovascular system. All of those different things that are changing are happening because the parasympathetic nervous system is driving them. So if you don't have parasympathetic nervous system activity, or it's not what it needs to be, then your fitness changes really won't be what they could be. It doesn't matter how hard you train. And this is something I hear all the time. Well, I'm training really hard, I'm not getting better. Well, maybe you're training hard enough, but your parasympathetic nervous system is not driving the energy into the recovery that it should be. And you're losing out on the performance gains that you could have if your recovery was better. So HRV has given us, again, a very good window into how well is our body recovering, how much energy is being driven into the recovery side of the equation. Okay, so really the big picture of HRV here is that it correlates to a lot of different things, from the risk of sudden death to overall life expectancy, cognitive function under stress, inflammation, aerobic fitness, markers of fatigue. It's really the big picture, because everything from how many steps you take a day, to how hard you train, to how you eat, to how much you sleep and you regenerate. All of those different things are functions of energy. And so HRV, because it shows us how the body is handling energy and how it's distributing energy throughout the body, that is why HRV is so important, because it's correlating all these different things through the common denominator of our body's energy currency, which is ATP, and telling us essentially how the body is handling it and what it's doing with it. Okay, so how do we measure HRV? This is a really, really important topic. This is something that drives the difference between very accurate measurements and very inaccurate measurements. And obviously, if you're going to spend the time measuring HRV, you want to make sure that you're doing it accurately. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of the different tools out there break down, because measuring HRV is unfortunately not the easiest thing in the world. It is a sensitive measure, so you've got to make sure it's done right. So let's talk about what that looks like. Okay. All right, so first, we have to understand that everything that affects the sympathetic nervous system has an impact on HRV. So the time of day that we measure HRV, if we measure HRV first thing in the morning versus later in the evening, we're going to see quite different numbers, because our body is in a different state depending on the time of day, our circadian rhythms, and all the other things. Body position. Okay, if we measure HRV seated versus standing versus laying down, our blood pressure changes, our HRV changes fairly significantly. So if we measure it, again, standing versus seated versus laying down, the HRV numbers are going to be very, very different. Even if we're laying down, let's say sleeping, which is a common use these days, if we are face down versus face up versus on our sides, all of those things are going to impact our HRV. So we can't necessarily compare different body positions. Okay, our breathing patterns, if we are breathing very slowly versus breathing very rapidly, that has a huge impact, because breathing is tied directly to HRV. So we have to make sure that our breathing patterns are somewhat consistent from one measurement to the next. Okay, stimulants, any sort of stimulant that you have is going to have a massive impact on your HRV. It's going to drive that sympathetic system. It's going to decrease the parasympathetic system. So it's going to have a really, really big impact on your HRV. And we got to make sure, again, we control those things as much as possible. Okay, and finally, any movements. And this is something that people need to understand. Any time that I am moving, I'm going to get what are called motion artifacts. And I'm going to essentially see what we call noise in the data. Essentially, what we're just seeing is that as sensors measure HRV, they're subject to noise artifacts and movement, particularly PPG sensors, which is what we'll talk about shortly. Those are going to basically make whatever measurement you have during any period of time very, very noisy and mostly useless. So HRV is not something you can measure just walking around. You're better off at that point just looking at heart rate, because heart rate is going to be more accurate at that point than just trying to measure very accurately the time from one heartbeat to the next. So the bottom line is mental stress, which I've got there too, is also a big factor in that. So if any of these things change from one HRV measurement to the next, then they're going to have a huge influence on it, and it's going to make that measurement much less valuable. So the only way to measure HRV accurately, and I cannot state this enough, is to standardize and take a reading each day as close to the same time and in the close to the same conditions as possible. When you measure HRV 24 hours a day, or you measure it overnight, you're really not seeing anything but lots and lots of noise in the system. And I know there are a lot of apps out there that are purporting to do this, but the reality and the truth is they're just measuring lots of noise 99% of the time. You would be better off just measuring heart rate at that point, because heart rate's much easier to measure accurately than HRV is, because in order to get HRV, we have to measure that little teeny R wave within plus or minus 1 to 2 milliseconds. That is a pretty high level of accuracy, and when you are moving around, it is simply not going to happen. You just don't get good measurements. You want to measure HRV in the same time a day, in the same body position, without the use of stimulants, without any movement, with as little minimal mental stress as possible. And you want to do that over and over again in order to make sure that you are comparing each day's measurement to the next, because that's the real value. Okay, so once you look at that importance of that, let's talk about how you actually calculate HRV, just to give you a rough overview here. And there's lots of calculations this is really just some of them on the left. There's really two kind of broad categories, what we call time domain and frequency, and they're really just looking at HRV using different mathematical formulas. There's nothing magic about them, but they just use different ways of measuring HRV, and there's some differences in exactly what they're looking at. But the first thing, like I just mentioned, is you have to have an accurate sensor, and you have to be able to measure that RR interval within about 1 to 2 milliseconds. Now this is unfortunately the case, but I hate to tell you, if you're using a wrist-based sensor, they are generally speaking not accurate. There's very, 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 very little research out there showing accurate HRV numbers out of a wrist-based sensor, because the wrist is an incredibly difficult place to measure blood flow. So as a whole, there's two different types of sensors. There's the chest strap, which is an EKG or ECG, and then there are what are called PPG sensors that are measuring changes in light through the skin. Anything that's on the arm or forearm, leg, like that is going to be a PPG sensor. And again, that's measuring changes of light coming back, reflecting through the skin. This is what Morpheus uses now. This is what a lot of other ones use. I'm not saying they can't be accurate, but they are not accurate, generally speaking, through the wrist. They are much more accurate further up on the forearm where we use Morpheus, because the wrist is just so difficult to make, to get an accurate measurement on. So if you were using a sensor that's on the wrist, the chance of it being highly accurate are very, very slim. There's very, very little research out there, again, showing that those numbers are accurate. In fact, I just did a huge research review, writing a section of the paper, or writing a section of the NCAA's new book on HRV, or includes HRV. And the amount of research out there that's looking at wrist-based HRV sensors is next to none. And the research that is out there essentially shows it's very inaccurate. So it's important to point out that matters a lot when you're talking about accuracy. Okay, the next is filtering ectopic beats. Now this is something that's hugely important as well, because ectopic beats are basically just beats that don't arise out of the normal mechanisms. And you also have to filter out movement, because again, these sorts of things can have huge impacts on our actual HRV numbers. If we don't filter those things properly, we get completely erroneous data. We get very inaccurate data. So you have to have a system that's very good at doing this. And unfortunately, there's no real way to know how this is being done, because each manufacturer, each app, each system is essentially doing its own thing. It's going to filter these things in its own way, and there's no real way of knowing what that is. But it's, again, it's a hugely important part. So that's why you want to use systems that have been around a while, that have some established history, that have people behind them that know what they're actually doing, because you're only going to get good measurements and good accuracy if that is done. Okay, and then third is really just the type of HRV calculation. Again, this is really important to point out. There's many different types of calculations here. Okay, there's SDNN, there's RMSSD, there's PNN50, there's different frequency measures. So different apps, different technologies are going to use different ones. Okay, we use RMSSD with Bioforce, my first one, and with Morpheus. A lot of them do use RMSSD. And then some of them do use other measurements. The iPhone, for example, the camera phone is using SDNN. So it's a very different measure of the same thing, or it's a different calculation of the same thing. But the numbers you're going to get are going to be different. So the bottom line, each system displays its own HRV calculation. And then many systems, Morpheus included, take that actual number, which would be in milliseconds, and they transform it, or they put it on a scale, or they do something that's more understandable. Because a raw HRV number in milliseconds is going to have all kinds of variability from one day to the next. It's going to jump all over the place. You make very little sense of it just looking at your raw number. It could be 200 one day, it could be 102 the next, it could be 80, it could be 50, it could be all over the place. So a lot of times these different apps, like mine and others, will then take that number and put it onto a scale. So why I mention that is that you simply cannot take one HRV number from one system and compare it to the next. And that even applies to my own two systems, Bioforce and Morpheus. You cannot compare your score in one system to the next. So you definitely cannot take, your HRV from an Apple Watch, compare it to Morpheus or any other system that you're using. You cannot compare your numbers from one system to the next. It just does not work that way. All right, so understanding the score. What we have to understand is that anytime our body is exposed to stress, primarily training or mental stress or travel, any sort of thing like that, we see basically what we call a load. That means the body shifts into that sympathetic state where energy is being mobilized, and then it shifts into this recovery state where energy is being directed into recovery. As that's happening, we are seeing changes in HRV. So when we're under immediate stress, we see HRV decrease. That's where I had this allostatic load. That just means allostatic load means any type of stress load on the system, HRV is going to go down. Now, as our body recovers from that, we're going to see HRV come back up. As that process happens, it's going to at some point come up kind of above that baseline number, and then it's going to kind of settle out. But the reality is that can happen at much different intervals depending on someone's fitness and depending on the level of training and stress and everything else. So if I put somebody under a huge load, the first new workout, I'm very sore, I see a big decrease in HRV. It might take 2 days for full recovery. The more they get used to that workout, the more their body has been accustomed to that, the faster that process is going to happen. So if we look at this on a 24-hour basis, we're going to see very different changes depending on how quickly the body is recovering. So again, the first few times we're exposed to workout, the next day we might see a very low HRV number. But over and over again, if we expose it to the same level of stress, the next day we might see a higher HRV number because our body is recovering faster now. If we measure it 3 weeks, 6 weeks down the road, our HRV might not change because it went through the whole stress recovery cycle within 24 hours. So we can't just look at one thing and say, oh, well, up is good and down is bad. That's unfortunately something that people tend to associate with HRV. It's not that one is good or bad. It's that both up or down tell us different things about where the body is at in that process. And one thing I'll say is a lot of times, again, people go in the gym, they train hard, and they say, well, my HRV is pretty much the same the next day. Does that mean I should have trained harder? Well, basically what it tells us is your body has already recovered from that load. It means your body is used to it because it's seen it over and over again because you're doing the same workout for the last 6 months. It generally means the body's not going to adapt to it any further because you've already maxed out what it can adapt to through that level of training. So you're going to have to change something. Maybe it is more volume or intensity. Maybe it's different exercises. Maybe it's something entirely different. But if you are seeing no change in your HRV from day to day, but you feel like you're training hard, the first question I always ask is, well, are you actually improving? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is, well, not really. Okay, well, there you go. You're not going to see the change if you're not improving. So again, we just want to understand that what we're looking at HRV is just this process happening over and over again. But then we're also seeing things like sleep and mental stress and nutrition either speed up that recovery process or slow down that recovery process. So that makes a huge, huge difference in terms of how those two are going to function together. Okay, so let me finish things up here, and then I'll get to some of the questions I've been seeing come through. So how to use HRV. This is really the most important part. Obviously, your goal here is to get as much out as possible. I can't spend 2 hours in this, but I want to just give you the high-level overview of really what the most important thing is. All right, so the first thing is just using it from a daily standpoint. We want to have this process in place where we're monitoring what's going on, we're assessing what it means, and then we're deciding whether or not we want to make any adjustments to our training. So when I build programs, I use different types of training days based on intensity and volumes I'm trying to achieve. So I use what I'd call a moderate day would be stimulation, a high intensity, high load day would be development, and then a rebound or recovery day. And essentially what I'm doing is using Morpheus, which gives me recovery score and HRV, to figure out whether or not that's the right thing to do. If I'm going to go into a Tuesday where I have a very high intensity workout planned and I see my recovery is lower, I'm just going to make an adjustment. I'm going to scale back my volume and intensity a bit. It doesn't mean I'm not going to work out. It doesn't mean I have to change the entire workout. It just means that I'm probably not going to do the same level of volume intensity as if my recovery was actually higher. So there's 3 basic rules that I'll use here when we come to this process. So the first is in general, we want to keep our HRV relatively close to our average throughout the week. We don't want to have huge swings up or down because that tells us that the body is going through periods of high stress. Now, again, when you are first introducing a new program into your life, you're going to see bigger swings, but as your body gets used to it, those are going to diminish pretty quickly. So we, generally speaking, depends on what system you're using, but around 80% if you're using Morpheus is the recovery score that we shoot for to keep ourselves above that the majority of the time. It doesn't mean it's never going to go below that, but it means we're trying to keep it there for the most part. So you can look here in this little screenshot to the right, that the amber or the orange bars there mean 80% to below, and the green means 80% or above. And you can see this person has a lot of days below 80% over that period of time, and overall, that's going to have a negative impact on their overall fitness, and they're going to be headed the wrong direction. So in general, we want to try to keep our HRV relatively consistent, at least as much as we can throughout the week within reason, knowing that that's not always in the case, but that's essentially what we're shooting for. Okay, number two, what I'm also trying to avoid here is just maximum changes or maximum volumes and intensities when I have a big change away from my baseline HRV. So if I have a big drop or even a big increase in HRV from one day to the next, I'm generally speaking going to try to avoid a high load and high intensity session, because that's going to slow my recovery down even more. All right, what do we want to say about HRV? The easiest thing we can say is it's not predicting performance, it is predicting recovery. So if I go into a workout and my HRV is off, my recovery is going to be significantly slower from that workout than if my recovery was high or my HRV was normal going into that workout. So we're just using HRV to say how much energy we have available towards recovery is the easiest way to look at it. If our HRV is close to baseline, we have a lot of energy available for recovery. If our HRV is far away from baseline, we don't have as much energy available for recovery, so it's going to take us longer to recover from that workout. So that is what we can use HRV for, is it's going to predict the recovery from a given workout. Far away from baseline, slower recovery. Closer to baseline, higher, faster recovery. Okay, and then finally, when we do see these really big swings away from our average, these are again very far swings away from what a normal is. And again, this depends on the system you're using, so I can't give you specifics unless you're using Morpheus. If you are far away from your baseline, it tells us the body is either acutely under a lot of stress, or it's still deeply recovering from something it was stressed out from, or stressed out by. So anytime we see these huge changes away from baseline, rest and recovery really becomes the recipe that you want to follow. So if you just stick to these three rules 99% of the time, you're going to see better results in your training, because you're going to avoid putting your body in a state where it's constantly trying to recover and can't quite keep up. And if we look at training on a weekly basis, it really becomes a game of, can we train the body enough in a week to stimulate fitness while still recover from that? And if we put too much training versus recovery throughout the week and we repeat that process over and over again, then gradually our body starts to break down. If we can train just enough to stimulate the body to get better, and we can help it recover as much as it can, so it's starting out each week fresh, then over time our body is going to get better. It's going to build itself up. It really is that simple. So from a training standpoint, what I do again is I use each of those days. I try to have a different level of stress. If I'm trying to do a rebound day, I'm trying to cause an increase in recovery, and generally speaking, that means an increase in HRV at that point. If I'm using my moderate intensity day, I'm trying to see a decrease in recovery by about 8 to 12% and a moderate change in HRV at that point. And if I'm using a development day, I'm going to see a fairly big change because I'm having a high load, high intensity. That's where I would expect to see a larger change in HRV the following day. So what I'm just doing is I'm using HRV and I'm using recovery, using Morpheus, whatever it is you are using, to make sure that whatever I have plans for that given day is appropriate. I don't want to, again, go into a very high load, high intensity day if my recovery is already lagging, because I'm just adding more load on top of more load. I'm slowing down my recovery even further. Okay, the second thing to do with HRV that's really valuable is, again, using the trends to track your fitness. Again, it's the trends over time. And what I mean by that is looking at your change in average HRV. So depending on, again, what system you're using, you may or may not be able to look at an average of your HRV. But if you can, that's going to provide the most valuable insight into whether or not your body's actually seeing a change in its fitness, particularly its aerobic fitness and its overall ability to mitigate against inflammation. So if you see this as my older system, BioForce HRV, and we could turn the HRV average on, that blue line is essentially looking at someone's change in average over a certain period of time. This is actually, that's back in 2013. That's about a 5-month period. And then the other one, you can see about a 4-month period. So you can see two very distinctly different trends there. You can see on the left-hand side, someone's HRV over that period of time gradually decreased. Now, something I want to point out here is if you only look at a single day, it's often not possible, or it's not very easy to discern the general direction of your HRV, because you can see by looking at the blue lines there were swings up and there were swings down. HRV tends to be pretty cyclical because it follows the weekly pattern. this is what it looks like when you see someone gradually overloading themselves a little too much a week by week. Over time, you see that blue line, that average HRV, start to decrease across that training cycle of several 5 months there. On the right, on the other hand, you can kind of see the same little cyclical patterns, but you see the person's HRV gradually go up across that time, starting at the mid to upper 70s all the way up to the mid 80s and a little bit beyond that towards the end. So you can see very different patterns by looking at these trends over time. So I generally speaking, want to look at the weekly trend, and I want to look at the monthly trend. And my goal is make sure that I'm not going down. And obviously, really, my goal is to make sure that I'm going up. So we looked at a couple months here of Morpheus data from our users, and we looked at basically after they first started using Morpheus, what was it doing for them? So we looked at their average HRV when they were first starting, and then we looked at their average HRV essentially across their first 2 months of use, just to see what does someone's change look like on average after a couple of months of actually using Morpheus and using HRV. And generally, you're going to see anywhere from 3 to 4 points of actual change in average HRV. So if you're started at 80, then you can expect to maybe be somewhere around 83, maybe 84 after a couple of months. So HRV does not change as an average, massively. Again, it's correlating to your fitness levels. Unless you're starting from a very low fitness level, it's going to take work to see your average change, which is why it's important to look at your average and not just look at a daily basis, because if you're looking only at the number each day, it's very, very difficult to kind of figure out what your HRV is doing. So looking at your averages, again, I like to look at a weekly and monthly basis, makes it much, much easier to say, yes, my fitness is actually improving, or no, my fitness isn't improving, in which case you want to figure out why. But looking again at this trending data is going to help you figure out whether or not you need to make changes to your program. And the biggest thing, like I said, people will see, oh, my HRV is not really changing. Well, yeah, but your fitness probably isn't changing either. So you need to do something to fix that. But you want to be able to see that before you go out to that race, before you go out to that whatever it is you're doing, and your performance didn't get any better from the last time. You could have seen that happening because you could have seen that your HRV was not changing at all, which meant your performance was likely to not change as well. The third reason, and to the biggest value here of HRV, is you can help build and reinforce better habits. Because when I was first using HRV way back in the early 2000s, the biggest thing I realized very early on was how much the things outside the gym drove the things that were happening inside the gym. In other words, people's sleep, people's mental stress from work, people's nutrition, people's activity levels, all of these things were driving the results of what was happening in the gym more than the workout itself oftentimes. And that's because of this concept. Okay, remember we talked about you have a certain amount of energy in the day, some's going to go to physical activity, some's going to go towards mental stress, and some's going to go towards recovery. If all of your energy is going towards physical activity and mental stress, and oftentimes those two are reversed there, you don't have enough left for recovery, then I don't care what you did in the gym, your workouts are going to suffer. So we can oftentimes help people and ourselves realize the impact of things like sleep, realize the impact of things like nutrition, and start to make better choices. Because as soon as somebody starts to get a couple nights of bad sleep and they see their HRV completely changed, it's a big eye-opener for a lot of people that what they're doing, is having a really bad impact or big impact negatively on their fitness level. So I've seen over many, many years, using HRV is a great way to help people get better results simply because they start making better decisions about, again, sleep and nutrition. They start learning how to deal with mental stress better, and they spend time meditating, and all of a sudden magically their fitness goes up. Even though I didn't have to make a huge change in their program, I simply got them focusing on their habits and making better choices. And again, if you don't have a measuring stick for this like HRV, it's a lot harder to convince somebody that they need to make changes. But when they can see it happening through their HRV numbers, then it's a much easier conversation to have with somebody or yourself. It's easier to make yourself take the right decision and maybe get a little bit extra sleep, or maybe spend 5 minutes a day meditating, or maybe skip that junk food if you can all of a sudden see the impact it's going to have on your recovery by seeing the change it has in your HRV. So it's really important, again, to use HRV not just to measure changes in fitness or to look at adjustments on a daily basis, but also to just help us build better lifestyle habits. Okay, common mistakes here to wrap things up. The first one, like I said, is a lot of times people do not measure HRV correctly. They're trying to use a 24-hour measurement, which is very, very difficult, if not impossible, and generally speaking, worthless for the most part. They don't standardize the conditions from one test to the next, or they measure HRV 2 times a week, or once a week, or once every 2 weeks. Infrequently measuring it is not really going to tell you a whole lot because you're just seeing little dots on the screen. You're really not able to paint the picture there without standardization and more frequent use. Now, there's a paper that came out a few years ago, and it showed basically you need a minimum of about 3 measurements per week for it to really have value. If you're doing less than 3 per week, you're probably not getting anything out of it, and more is generally speaking going to be better. Okay, the second one is just people oftentimes will overreact or they'll overanalyze one single measurement. You know, why did my HRV do this? Why did I do that? Well, I don't know. It could have been a lot of things. Okay, remember, HRV is not just reflecting one thing, it's reflecting everything. So it could have been that you had some food that your body didn't react well with. It could have been you had an extra cup of coffee that you forgot about. It could have been you didn't sleep particularly well last night and you forgot, you know, that you had something to do in the morning, so you were stressed out all night thinking about it. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that HRV can change on a single day, so we don't need to overanalyze a single day's measurement. Okay. The other one is just failing to look at the big picture. This is something people do often. They often say, well, my HRV is doing this, but my workout, you know, was really hard and my HRV didn't change. Well, again, or vice versa. The workout was really easy, but my HRV is all over the place, because in our minds, it's easy to think that the workout is the only thing driving our recovery or our HRV, but that's just not the case. You know, the workout is an hour a day. It's everything else that's the other 23 hours, and those add up to a tremendously big piece. So you can't just look at training and think training equals HRV. Think hard workout equals HRV change, or easy workout doesn't equal HRV change. That's just not how it works. Remember, we're looking at the big picture of autonomic nervous system. We're looking at how the body is compartmentalizing and distributing energy based on everything that you're doing to it, not just the workout, but everything else as well. So you can't just look at HRV and think that all it's showing you is your workout, or think that your workout is hard, therefore, you know, X, Y, or Z has to happen with your HRV, and because it didn't, that means HRV is wrong. No, it just means HRV is more complicated and telling you more things than just what you did in the gym yesterday. Okay, and then the fourth thing, like I said, a lot of times people look at HRV on a daily basis. They're just kind of looking at their score each day. Maybe they're making better decisions about what they're doing. But in generally, they're not looking at the trends. And the trends are where the real value is to help you confirm whether or not your program is actually working. And it's going to be just helping you make decisions about what your training program should look like. If it's working, great, you know, keep it up. But if you're seeing no changes in HRV across, you know, 6 weeks, then something needs to change, because what you're doing is not improving your fitness, or at least not improving the aerobic component of your fitness. And chances are, if you are doing something performance-based, you're not going to see any changes relative to what it was before. So we want to look at those trends. Again, I like to use a 7-day trend and a 30-day trend to help you understand whether or not your fitness is going to actually see a positive change. So you can't look at that daily picture and see that. You've got to look at trend data. Okay, additional resources to wrap things up here, and then I'll kind of look through some questions. The first one is just, what HRV apps do I recommend? Well, obviously I'm biased. I recommend Morpheus. That's the app I created. I think it's the best out there, and it also shows you more than HRV. But if you're going to use just a pure HRV app, there's 3 that I would say I would recommend as being accurate and reliable, and I would suggest you use them if you want to use something other than Morpheus for whatever reason. The first being iThlete. iThlete was one of my original partners in creating BioForce HRV. iThlete is 100% accurate. It is a good HRV app. It's a solid platform. And Simon Wiegriff, who I'll mention down below, is a knowledgeable guy in the industry, been around for a long time. The second one would be HRV for training. That one primarily uses the camera phone app, just a camera phone on your phone, the camera on your phone, which does have some problems in accuracy, but it can be done, generally speaking, for the most part, reliably. And of course, you don't need any sensor, which does have, you know, that advantage to it. So it's better than, you know, not measuring HRV for sure. And generally speaking, it can be done accurately. Omega Wave is another good one. It's one of the first one. It is literally the first one I ever used. The Omega Wave has been around for a long time, developed by the Russians, and they were really the first ones that pioneered HRV. It does tend to give you too much data, in my opinion, but it does give you accurate data. So all of these ones are the ones that I believe are accurate. If I did not put it on that list, unfortunately, I do not think it's particularly accurate, and I have not seen it be accurate. So Whoop is not accurate. Oura, to my experience so far, not particularly accurate in HRV. They may be accurate in other areas in terms of sleep or whatever, but as far as HRV goes, they are not accurate, and I have not seen a whole lot of any other apps outside these ones that have been consistently proven to be accurate. Okay, other people to follow, aside from myself, if you want to learn more about HRV, Martin Buchheitz, a very good researcher. I believe he's down in Australia, if I remember correctly. He posts quite a bit on a website blog, and he does a lot of research on HRV and heart rate and different topics. So I reference his work quite a bit. Good guy to follow. Simon Uyghur, if I mentioned, from iThlete, another good guy to follow, and Marco Altini, who's at HRV for Training. If you want to dig into the HRV for Training blog, Marco posts quite a bit of scientific data on there, and is a researcher himself. So all these guys that I mentioned here to follow, these are legitimate research guys. Okay, they're all highly qualified, they're specialized, they're knowledgeable, they're very, very good. These are the guys that I would go talk to about HRV. I have conversations with. These are the guys whose work I read. So if there's somebody else out there that I'm unaware of, they may be good, but these are certainly the guys that I pay the most attention to. Aside from that, 8 weeks out, if you're not on my website, I do post about HRV quite a bit about that. If you want to actually learn how to write conditioning programs and increase HRV, my BioForce conditioning cert does that. And something I'm hard at work on right now is what I call the Recover to Win 30-day fitness reset. That'll be out the next couple of months, but it's going to help people put all these different pieces from movement to training, activity, sleep, nutrition, everything else to get better recovery and to maximize all the different things we've talked about. So that wraps up the presentation. I'm going to go through here, just answer whatever questions I have left, and I'll jump off. So again, thanks again for listening. I will post a replay of this. You'll be able to come back to it, and I'll take a couple seconds here to look at some questions. And if you guys have any additional questions you haven't asked, feel free to type them, and I will jump in. Okay, question here. Opinion on Elite HRV. I have a couple of things. Elite HRV's research was done not too long ago, and a couple years ago, essentially showed it was inaccurate. I think it could have been some of their filtering algorithms, who knows at the time. And honestly, I have a bit of a problem with them because they stole some of my intellectual material and put it into their course without my permission. So that's a long story. I won't get into details, but in general, I'm not a fan of Elite HRV for those reasons. Oura Ring, again, I think Oura Ring, generally speaking, is pretty accurate in terms of sleep. I know it's obviously very easy for people to use, and a lot of people like it. As far as the HRV, I've not seen it be particularly accurate. For the HRV side, the difficult thing, though, about Oura is I don't know exactly when it's being measured. And again, if you're just wearing something around, it's very difficult to get measurements accurately because Oura doesn't know if you're standing up versus sitting down. It doesn't know what time of day it is necessarily. It can't measure it in a very standardized condition. It doesn't know what you had to drink a minute ago. So if you can't get standardization in that, then you really can't get consistent measurements on a daily basis to compare against. So it's much more difficult to get it accurately. So I think, again, the Oura Ring is a good ring, or a good tool for sleep. It can be accurate for activity. But as far as HRV goes, it's probably not quite as accurate as I would like to see, at least not that I've seen so far. All right, any other questions before I wrap this up here? Only wearing your Oura Ring at night, does that help? I mean, again, I don't know when exactly Oura is measuring your HRV. So the problem with nighttime measurements, for the most part, again, your body is going to change position. Sometimes you're sleeping on your stomach, sometimes you're sleeping on your side, sometimes you're sleeping on your back. All those sorts of things are simply going to change. So your HRV is going to change based on those different body positions. But Oura Ring or Whoop Ring or Whoop Band, for that matter, they have no clue what body position you're in. That's the first problem with trying to measure. All right. The second problem with it is as your fitness improves, your HRV goes up, and at some point it maxes out, and that max out happens when you're sleeping. So somebody who's in reasonably good condition is going to have basically their maximum HRV overnight. It's not going to get any higher. So you're just kind of seeing this maxed out number every night once you hit a certain point of fitness. So again, it's not going to be accurate. So yeah, Whoop, of course, Whoop says 24-hour accurate is more accurate. That's what they're selling, but it's just not true. Okay, again, I've done the research. I've done a lot of research, particularly for this section in the book in the NCAA. There is no good research that shows 24-hour measurement is the way to go or more accurate. And even more, there is literally zero research showing 24-hour measurement HRV using the PPG and the sensor wrist on the wrist is accurate. There is no research whatsoever. Ask them for it. It does not exist. So unfortunately, it'd be nice if that were possible to get accurate data that way, but it is simply not. Anyone who is selling you differently is selling something, because there is no research to support that. And again, feel free to reach out to the people I recommended there, Martin, Simon, Marco. They will all tell you the same thing, because we've all tried to find a great solution for HRV overnight, but it simply does not exist. And measuring more frequently does not mean more data. It just means more potential problems and more opportunities for inaccurate data, unfortunately. So again, all the research out there, especially in the sport and fitness world, it's done primarily measuring HRV once a day in the morning, because that's the easiest way to get standardized data to compare to, rather than getting noisy data from measuring it all the time. Gregory Diaz, yeah, you'll be able to get a recording of this, so if you missed the whole thing, you'll get access to it afterwards. All right, guys, I'm going to head out here. I appreciate everyone joining me, and I'll talk to you again next time.